October 12th, 1492. 3 Spanish ships land on an island in the Caribbean. A flag is planted in the sand. The Lucayan people, who have lived here for generations, watch from the tree line. They don't know it, but their world is about to end forever. Tonight, we explore what came next and how the modern world was created. This is the story of colonialism, a transformation so total that we mistake its results for the natural order of things. Yet it turns out the world as it is today was violently assembled in just the last 500 years. How did this happen? How did a handful of European kingdoms redraw the map of the entire planet? And how was a new idea, race, forged into a tool for controlling its people? 500 years ago, the world operated on different terms. It was a mosaic of empires, city-states, and nomadic confederations. Your identity was tied to your clan, your religion, or your king. The idea of belonging to a continent or a race didn't exist. In tonight's episode, we'll trace how the colonial project went from a few coastal forts to a global system of extraction and control. Along the way, we'll see how techniques of rule developed in one colony were exported to another. You'll also meet the people who resisted this new order, discovering how their struggle created the world we inhabit today. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. So, let's now begin to trace the most extraordinary transformation of humanity in our history. This is the story of how colonialism changed the world forever. Chapter 1. The Conqueror's Blueprint. The plaza spreads out before you, a perfect square of order imposed on conquered earth. It's September in the year 1523, and you're standing in what was once the heart of Tenochtitlan, the great Aztec capital. Now, Spanish boots click across stones that indigenous feet carved with symbols of a different world. Look to your left. The Cabildo rises, its limestone facade still dusty from construction. Government clerks shuffle papers inside, recording who owns what in this new world. Across the plaza, hammers ring against stone as workers raise a cathedral directly over the ruins of the Templo Mayor. Between these two powers sits the court, and just behind it, the jail. This trinity of control, state, church, law, would be stamped across the Americas like a brand on flesh. They called it the Traza, this replicable blueprint for power. From Havana to Cuzco, from Mexico City to Lima, the same pattern emerged. Green plaza, government buildings, cathedral, court, jail. A formula as precise as any mathematical equation, designed to overwrite one civilization with another. For the Inca who watched their sacred sites demolished, This wasn't just architecture. Their world had been mapped by huacacuna, sacred shrines that charged the landscape with meaning. Pachacamac wasn't merely a place. It was, as they understood it, the place that charges the world with being. Mountains spoke, rocks held ancestors, rivers carried prayers. The Spanish mercenaries saw none of this. Where indigenous peoples found divinity inscribed in hills and burial grounds, the conquistadors found opportunities. Plunder here, a mine there, land to parcel out among themselves. They operated within their own myth, that they had been chosen to bring civility and salvation to those they called savages. Every cathedral they erected on sacred ground was more than a building. It was a ritual of supremacy. Massive stones piled high to reaffirm what they desperately needed to believe, that their conquest was righteous, that their rule was permanent. The precariousness of this myth required constant reinforcement through stone and mortar. The system they imported came straight from the feudal fields of southern Atlantic Europe. Latifundia, those vast landed estates where peasants labored for aristocratic lords. The capitation, a head tax that bound workers to their masters. Strict codes about who could wear what colors, ride which animals, carry what weapons. Every detail designed to make hierarchy visible and permanent. But something new was stirring in this old feudal structure. The word colony itself comes from the Latin colonus, meaning tiller or farmer, rooted in working the earth. Yet these new world ventures pulsed with a different energy. This wasn't just about land anymore. The ocean itself became a commodity. Ships could now recombine the labors of peoples separated by thousands of miles of water. Feudalism was learning to swim. The primary tool of this new exploitation was the encomienda system. The crown would assign entire indigenous communities to individual conquistadors. These encomenderos gained the right to impose head taxes and command the labor of up to 300 indigenous persons each. Bodies became currency. Communities became property. By 1542, the encomienda gave way to the repartimiento, a tribute labor system that sounds almost clinical in its efficiency. Indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands and forced to work without pay for fixed periods. The Spanish introduced mandatory costumes to track the population, making surveillance as simple as spotting the wrong cloth in the wrong place. The evolution continued. By the 1550s, the hacienda system emerged, foreshadowing the industrial plantation. Workers were forcibly relocated onto land enclaves where they could be bought, sold, and confined. By the 1600s, ships arrived bearing kidnapped Africans to join this machinery of extraction. All of this theft was justified through a European legal concept called inventio, discovery. Simply by intending to settle and cultivate land, colonizers could claim title to it. The combination was toxic. Hunger for land, feudal license, patriarchal control, state intervention. Together they generated a noxious mix of colonial violence that would reshape continents. This vast blueprint for conquest was never an end in itself. It was an engine designed with precision for a single purpose. Deep in the mountains of Bolivia and Mexico, in veins of silver that ran like frozen lightning through rock, lay the fuel that would power a global empire. The plaza, the cathedral, the courts, all of it was prologue to what came next. Good evening, friend. Sorry to interrupt. This is Charles, the creator of History After Dark. If you're enjoying this exploration, I'm glad. I'm incredibly passionate about making these histories accessible. As you've probably noticed, there are a small number of ads on the channel now. These only continue until about 20 minutes in. The revenue this generates is what allows me to continue doing this work. If you'd rather support directly and watch ad-free, I now have a Patreon. Members get access to the full library without interruptions, and your support makes a real difference. Thank you. Now, back to the story of colonialism. Chapter 2. The Silver Veins of Empire. Deep beneath Cerro Rico, the mountain that looms over Potosí, Bolivia, men crawl through darkness. The year is 1565, and the tunnels already honeycomb the earth for miles. The Quechua name for this place translates to thunder, and down here you understand why. Every hammer strike against rock echoes like the mountain's own heartbeat, angry and endless. The Spanish called these the man-eating mines. Workers descended on rope ladders that vanished into blackness, some shafts dropping 800 feet straight down. At the bottom, the air hung thick with dust and the sweet sick smell of mercury used to refine the ore. Men worked by candlelight, their shadows dancing on walls that glittered with veins of silver. When their shift ended, if they survived it, workers climbed back up those same ladders, carrying baskets of ore that weighed 3 times their own body weight. One slip meant death. The Spanish overseers counted the baskets, not the bodies. This immense deposit of silver under the mantle of a mountain, along with the mines at Zacatecas in Mexico, became the most important source of wealth in what historians would later call the emerging capitalist world system. The technology that made it possible arrived in the 1550s. Mercury from Almaden, Spain, which allowed for more efficient refining. Indigenous chemistry met European metallurgy, creating a fusion of knowledge that would drain continents of their wealth. The meter system supplied the bodies. This rotational forced labor regime demanded that 1/7 of all eligible men aged 18 to 50 living near the Potosí mines report for bondage every year. 91,000 men in the region, 13,000 at any given time descending into darkness, entire villages emptied of their fathers and sons. The social fabric of the Andes shredded under this pressure. When Mitayos failed to survive their terms and thousands didn't, their families starved. Communities that had thrived for centuries collapsed. The indigenous response was mass exodus and escape. The population around Potosí plummeted by more than 2/3 in less than a century. People fled to the high plateaus, to ravines, anywhere beyond the reach of Spanish census takers. Yet, even within this system of terror, indigenous agency persisted. A class of indigenous merchants known as hateras became essential intermediaries, bringing the silver to market. They knew the mountain paths, spoke both Quechua and Spanish, understood the complex logistics of moving metal from mine to mint to port. They were simultaneously embedded in transoceanic trade and in local cultures and technologies, walking between worlds. From the mines, the river of silver flowed across the globe via the Manila galleon trade route, operating from 1565 to 1825. Ships the size of castles crossed the Pacific, their holds packed with silver bars and pieces of 8. The naturalist Alexander von Humboldt memorably described it as the trade in silver and friars, wealth and religion traveling the same routes, transforming everything they touched. By the early 1600s, at least 100,000 kilograms of silver circulated through the port of Manila annually. Profit ratios reached 300 to 400%. European merchants used this American silver to purchase Asian luxury goods, silk from China, spices from the Moluccas, porcelain so fine you could see light through it. In 1570, Spanish forces invaded Manila, then an Islamic polity ruled by Raja Suleiman III. They waged war, took violent possession of the beachhead, executed the indigenous ruler and his family, and founded a settlement colony. The sword was married with the baptismal font, violence and conversion intertwined. A single object embodies this entire global network: a silk priest's robe, a chasuble, commissioned in Manila by Spanish missionaries and woven by Chinese artisans. 20,000 stitches in just 4 centimeters of cloth, the Buddhist eternal knot woven together with Spanish Catholic symbols, histories of Tagalog shipbuilding and dock labor, Chinese artisan labor, and indigenous American enslaved mining labor condense into its embroidery. The Spanish had used American silver to weave a web of global trade, connecting continents in a network of extraction that reached from the Andes to Asia. As their galleons crossed the Pacific, laden with silver and souls, another European power was establishing itself in North America with different ambitions. They came not seeking gold or converts, but land itself. They came to stay. Chapter 3. The Settler's Claim. The ship creaks in the harbor at Plymouth, Massachusetts, in the year 1630. Below deck, families huddle among their possessions: iron pots, woolen blankets, Bibles wrapped in oilcloth against the salt spray. These English settlers are refugees from a world torn apart by civil wars, religious persecution, epidemics that swept through villages, leaving more dead than alive. Thomas Hobbes had described their homeland as a war of all against all, and they believed him. John Winthrop, governor of the Massachusetts colony, stands at the rail watching the shoreline. He sees what he needs to see a vacuum domicilium, a vacuum of inhabitation. The smoke from Wampanoag cooking fires rises in the distance. The cleared fields where indigenous peoples grow corn, beans, and squash stretch toward the forest. Winthrop sees none of it. His legal fiction requires blindness. For the settlers, the pursuit of peace required the ongoing waging of colonial war against natives. This irony would define everything that followed. They fled violence in England only to create worse violence here. They sought religious freedom while denying the legitimacy of indigenous spiritual practices. They wanted safety and found it only through making others unsafe. Cotton Mather provided the theological justification. He called native peoples the veriest ruins of mankind and described New England as land that was once the devil's territories. His sermons rang from wooden pulpits in churches that smelled of pine sap and tallow candles. Congregations nodded along, finding comfort in his words. If the land belonged to the devil, then taking it was God's work. The philosopher John Locke gave this theft its intellectual architecture. Writing in 1689, he argued, "It is labor, then, which puts the greatest part of value upon land, without which it would scarcely be worth anything. Nature and the earth furnished only the almost worthless materials, as in themselves. By defining value exclusively through ploughing, fencing, and sowing, Locke erased millennia of indigenous land management. Controlled burns that cleared underbrush, seasonal migrations that allowed land to recover, the careful tending of wild plants. None of this counted as improvement in Locke's equation. For the Ojibwe, the land was Abenaki, our land, a living being that could no more be owned than wind or sunlight. For Locke and his readers, it was an inert commodity awaiting improvement through private ownership. This worldview provided an existential justification for settler colonial war. The Pequot War began in 1636. Connecticut militia conducted what witnesses called a ruthless and genocidal killing spree. They surrounded a Pequot village near the Mystic River at dawn. They set it ablaze and shot anyone who fled the flames. 400 people died in under an hour. The survivors were shipped to Bermuda and Barbados to be sold into slavery, creating a direct link between settler expansion in the north and the Caribbean plantation economy. King Philip's War erupted in 1675 when Metacomet, the Wampanoag leader the English called King Philip, could no longer tolerate the relentless encroachment of the Plymouth colony. The Mohican leader Oaneko called it the war with the general nations of the Indians. It claimed more casualties per capita than any other conflict on American soil over the following 300 years. The numbers tell only part of the story. The native population in New England fell from a quarter of the total to just 1/10. Entire peoples disappeared. Languages that had been spoken for thousands of years went silent. The survivors were forced onto reservations like Natick, patches of unwanted land where they were meant to disappear quietly. Mary Rowlandson, captured during the war, wrote later about seeing indigenous children dying of starvation as their communities were systematically destroyed. She described it with a kind of detached horror, as if watching a storm destroy trees. The settlers had learned to see indigenous death as natural, even necessary. The wars of elimination had cleared the land, leaving behind survivors who refused to vanish. The settlers realized that violence alone wouldn't complete their project. They needed new weapons, deeds and laws and prayers. They needed to reach into indigenous communities and transform them from within to kill the Indian and save the man, as they would later say. The reservation at Natick would become a laboratory for this new kind of warfare, one that targeted souls rather than bodies. Chapter 4. Praying Towns and the Trail of Tears. Inside the meeting house at Natick, Massachusetts, in the late 1600s, Reverend Daniel Takawampfate runs his hand along the surface of his preacher's desk. His fingers trace the deerskin motif carved into the sides. Invisible to the English visitors who sit in the front pews, but perfectly visible to his Wampanoag congregation behind them. The desk's feet have been carved to resemble deer hooves, a detail that makes the English uncomfortable, though they can't quite say why. 2 Algonquin woodworkers had crafted this desk for him, understanding exactly what he needed. The front facing the English shows proper colonial American styling, all straight lines and Protestant restraint. The sides and back tell a different story. Here in this praying town, Christianity has become a container for something else, something older that refuses to die. The people who gathered in these Christian Indian towns had made a calculated choice. Smallpox and syphilis were killing more effectively than English muskets ever could. Traditional healers had no medicine for European diseases. Some native peoples saw the Christian God as a practical shield against both illness and English violence. If praying to this new deity might stave off killer diseases, if conversion might protect their children from slavery in Barbados, then they would pray. The Anishinaabe author Gerald Vizenor would later call this survivance, survival plus resistance, the active presence of native peoples rather than their absence. Every hymn sung in Wampanoag, every sermon that wove traditional stories into biblical parables, every Christian prayer that began with an acknowledgement of the land's original spirits, these were acts of preservation disguised as submission. While some found refuge in praying towns, others faced dispossession through the machinery of colonial law. The settlers had discovered that debt worked better than bullets. Between 1658 and 1660, Humphrey Atherton, a Massachusetts militia member, and his syndicate used carefully constructed debts to foreclose on the entire Narragansett country, roughly 96 square kilometers of prime land. The mortgage had become a weapon of conquest. The fur trader John Pynchon perfected this technique. He extended a 75-pound credit to the Sachem Umpashala for goods that Umpashala's people needed to survive the winter. When spring came and the debt couldn't be paid, Pynchon took the land that would become West Hadley. leaving Umpashla with 2 hectares of swamp. English common law still prevented creditors from seizing a debtor's land in England, but in the colonies, those protections had been quietly removed. This process of legal theft accelerated in the 1800s as the Cotton Kingdom expanded across the South. The historian Ronald Takaki observed that in order to make way for white settlement and the expansion of both cotton cultivation and the market, 70,000 natives were uprooted and moved from their lands, and hundreds of thousands of blacks were moved into the Southwest to work the soil as slaves. The gears of native dispossession and black enslavement turned together, each driving the other. Alexis de Tocqueville witnessed the Choctaw removal in 1831 and left us this account. It was then the middle of winter, and the cold was unusually severe. The snow had frozen hard upon the ground, and the river was drifting huge masses of ice. The Indians had their families with them, and they brought in their train the wounded and sick, with children newly born and old men upon the verge of death. The dogs understood what was happening before their masters could admit it to themselves. As soon as the animals perceived that their masters were finally leaving the shore, they set up a dismal howl, and plunging all together into the icy waters of the Mississippi, they swam after the boat. The animals knew this was an ending, not a journey. The Supreme Court formalized this dispossession in 1831 through Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, designating native communities as domestic dependent nations. The legal language was precise and cold. They were within the United States but not of it, subject to its power but excluded from its protections. The trail of tears had cleared the land for cotton, that white gold that would transform the American South. The fertile soil of Georgia and Alabama, tended for centuries by Creek and Cherokee hands, now awaited a different kind of cultivation. It would need workers, millions of them, and for that the ships were already crossing the Atlantic, their holds packed with human cargo. The door of no return was swinging open, and through it would pass the bodies needed to work the stolen land. Chapter 5. The Door of No Return. The dungeons of Elmina Castle smell of salt and fear. Built by the Portuguese in 1482 on the coast of what is now Ghana, the fortress rises white against the African sky. Below, in darkness so complete it feels solid, hundreds of people wait. They've been here for weeks, maybe months, chained in spaces so tight that sitting means touching another's flesh, standing means breathing another's breath. Above them, Portuguese and later Dutch governors conduct business in airy rooms with windows facing the sea. They write letters home about gold prices and ivory shipments. They complain about the heat. They never mention the sound that rises through the floorboards at night, the keening that comes from below. The British called the practice panyaring, the kidnapping and theft of human beings. Raiders would strike at dawn, surrounding villages while people slept. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. Husbands watched their wives disappear into coffle lines that snaked toward the coast. The march could take months, Those who fell were left to die. Those who survived reached places like Elmina. In 1526, Nzinga Mbemba, king of the Congo, sent letters to the Portuguese court. The mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives. They grab them and get them to be sold. His protests were met with silence, then with threats. Resistance took every form human courage could devise. Armed rebellions erupted along the coast. People fled to fortified settlements in the interior. On the ships themselves, coordinated revolts broke out so frequently that sailors lived in constant fear. Captives staged hunger strikes, choosing death over bondage. Some found ways to throw themselves overboard, and there are accounts of people singing as they drowned, their voices carrying across the water. Those who couldn't escape faced the door of no return, a narrow opening in the castle's sea-facing wall. Once you passed through, you left not just Africa, but your name, your language, your links to ancestors. The philosopher Sylvia Wynter defined it precisely. The Negro was no longer a slave, as in the African tribal context. He was now essentially a form of labor power calculated in terms of his exchange value, bought and sold, not as a slave, but as a commodity. They were called pieces, pieza in Spanish, Peça da India in Portuguese. An able-bodied man counted as one full piece. Women and children were valued at 2/3 of a unit. Olaudah Equiano, who survived this system, recalled watching human beings being put into scales and weighed, and then sold from 3 pence to 6 or 9 pence a pound. The Middle Passage turned the ocean into a graveyard. Ships designed for 200 carried 600. People were packed into holds so tight they couldn't sit up. The air grew so foul that candles wouldn't burn below deck. Diseases spread through bodily fluids that had nowhere to drain. Sailors said you could smell a slave ship from 5 miles away. Yet even in this abyss, new bonds formed. People who spoke different languages learned to communicate through touch and song. They shared what little water they had. They held the dying. They created kinship in the belly of the ship. The poet Dion Brand writes of this inheritance. Water is the first thing in my memory. The sea sounded like 1,000 secrets, all whispered at the same time. Jan Nieser, a mulatto African trader born in 1756, left us a document that makes the economics visceral. In a letter to his Liverpool business partners in 1803, he details a transaction: 400 slaves in exchange for Danish guns, rum, Indian textiles, including 200 cellos and 300 castracundis, human lives equated with pieces of cloth calculated down to the last thread. Toni Morrison dedicated her novel, Beloved, to the 60 million and more who didn't survive. The number is unknowable. Ship's logs record some who died, ignore others. The Atlantic keeps its own count in bones scattered across the ocean floor from Senegal to South Carolina. Those who survived the crossing found themselves standing on American soil, often in places like Charleston or Port-au-Prince, staring at a landscape that looked nothing like home. Before them stretched fields of sugarcane and cotton, crops that would devour their lives with mechanical precision. They had arrived at the engine room of the colonial world. Chapter 6. The Plantation Factory. In the mountains above St. Domingue, smoke rises from cooking fires that shouldn't exist. The year is 1750, and in the ravines and thick woods of the Massif du Nord, communities of escaped slaves have built whole villages. They call this the Grand Marinage, the permanent flight to freedom. Children who have never known chains play in clearings their parents carved from wilderness. These settlements in the clouds will become the staging grounds for revolution. Down below, on the coastal plains, St. Domingue generates more than a quarter of France's entire annual income. 500,000 enslaved Africans work the sugar fields, while 25,000 whites live in mansions built from sugar profits. Sidney Mintz called the plantation an early form of the industrial factory, and here you can see why. The fields stretch geometrically precise, divided into sections that correspond to work gangs, each gang corresponding to a shift on the labor clock is less than jaune. 5 hash is greater than. The cane fields operate on a 24-hour cycle during harvest. First shift cuts the cane under stars that provide the only light. Second shift loads the cut stalks onto carts pulled by humans when the oxen die from exhaustion. Third shift feeds the cane into crushing mills that never stop turning. The boiling houses run continuously, their fires tended by children who learn to sleep, standing up, jerking awake when the heat drops and the overseer's whip cracks. Inside the great house, a different kind of labor unfolds. Enslaved women cook elaborate meals for masters who complain if the sauce is too thick. They clean chamber pots and wash undergarments stained with evidence of last night's excess. They comb their mistress's hair each morning, listening to complaints about the heat, while sweat runs down their own backs. At night, they put the master's children to bed with lullabies from Africa, songs their own children will never hear. The Royal House in Massachusetts shows how this system reached into the North. In 1737, an enslaved man named Hector organized a revolt on the estate. He was burned alive for conspiracy to revolt, the flames visible from Boston Harbor. The message was clear. Resistance meant not just death, but spectacular death. Death as public theater. Yet in the quarters behind the Royal House, archaeologists have found gaming pieces. Marbles formed from fired clay, tiles made from broken china plates. The enslaved were stealing time from the slave owner's clock in order to rest and play. Each marble rolled was an act of defiance. Each game a declaration that they remained human despite everything. Across the Caribbean, enslaved people cultivated provision grounds, small plots where they grew yams and callaloo that tasted of home. They developed their own economies, their own banking systems like the ASU, where groups would pool resources and take turns accessing credit. On Sundays, if Sundays were granted, markets erupted, where people traded not just vegetables but news, gossip, fragments of remembered songs. The work songs that echoed across the fields contained whole philosophies. Clyde Woods called this the blues mode of social explanation. One song preserved these lyrics. They'll put you under a man called Captain Jack, who'll write his name up and down your back, the whip as pen, the back as paper, the body as the document of ownership. The songs understood the system better than any economist. Religious practices transformed and survived. Lemba, a healing cult from the Congo, provided structures for secret oaths and mutual aid. Vodun from the Benin coast offered spiritual technologies for liberation. These weren't just beliefs, but organizational systems, ways of knowing and being that the plantation could never fully crush. In 1791, the Maroons descended from their mountain strongholds. Fires spread across the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, each burning plantation a signal to the next. The enslaved on the plantations rose to meet them. Within 13 years, the most profitable slave colony on earth would become Haiti, the first free black republic. Sojourner Truth would later describe her activism as a waking from a mortifying delusion. Harriet Jacobs wrote that no words could convey the horror. "O virtuous reader, you never knew what it was to be a slave." The plantation had been designed as a perfect machine for extraction, but the human spirit proved impossible to fully mechanize. The flames of the Haitian Revolution sent smoke signals to every corner of the Atlantic world. In London and Paris, in Richmond and Rio, those who profited from human bondage understood that their system could fall. They would need new methods, new justifications, new ways to extract labor from bodies while claiming their hands were clean. Chapter 7: Gunboats and Opium. The petition arrives in 1859, written in careful script by 14 Chinese laborers on a Cuban sugar plantation. They describe their free labor contract. If a Chinese person did not have the proof issued from the owner, he could not apply for a freedom paper from the official. Without that paper, one could not walk on the street. They are trapped in a maze of permits and fines, their freedom always one missing document away. These men are part of what some historians call the second slavery, a system that emerged after the formal abolition of chattel slavery in the British Empire. They were recruited in Guangzhou or Xiamen with promises of good wages and return passage. They discovered the truth only at sea when it was too late to turn back. The contracts they'd signed, often with a thumbprint because they couldn't read, bound them for 8 years of labor that differed from slavery only in name. The ports made this system possible. Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong. These weren't just places where ships docked. They were governmental apparatuses for commanding human movement, sorting bodies into categories of permitted and forbidden, processing people like customs goods. European powers had seized control of these ancient trading centers, transforming them into valves that regulated the flow of labor across oceans. Joint stock companies had pioneered this control. The British East India Company operated as a sovereign power with its own army of 200,000 sepoys, its own currency, its own courts. It negotiated treaties, waged wars, collected taxes. By 1800, it ruled 90 million people in India, more than the population of Britain itself. This wasn't trade. It was governance by corporation. Adam Smith provided the intellectual framework, marveling at Asian commerce while ignoring the violence that made European participation possible. His concept of free trade became the banner under which gunboats sailed into foreign harbors. The French forced Haiti to begin paying its crushing indemnity in 1825, warships bobbing in Port-au-Prince harbor as President Boye signed. The British forced open Turkish markets in 1838, cannon pointed at Constantinople during negotiations. The Opium Wars revealed the true nature of this free trade. By the 1830s, Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China, spending fortunes on tea, silk, and porcelain. The solution was narcotics. The East India Company forced Indian farmers to grow opium poppies instead of food, processed the harvest in factories in Patna and Benares, then smuggled thousands of tons into China each year. When Chinese officials burned 20,000 chests of opium in 1839, trying to stop the epidemic of addiction ravaging their country, Britain declared war. More than 40 warships descended on Guangzhou. The technological mismatch was absolute. British steam-powered gunboats could sail up rivers against the current, appearing wherever they chose. Chinese war junks, magnificent under sail, sat helpless when the wind died. 20,000 Chinese died. Britain lost 69 men. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 dismembered Chinese sovereignty. 5 ports were forced open to foreign trade. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. Foreign nationals gained extraterritoriality, meaning they couldn't be tried in Chinese courts, even for crimes committed on Chinese soil. The treaty established the principle that would govern the next century. Asian sovereignty was negotiable. European liberty was not. Shanghai transformed from a walled city into an international settlement where European law governed Chinese streets. The Bund, that famous waterfront, filled with neoclassical banks and trading houses, their facades facing the Huangpu River like fortresses. Inside these buildings, contracts were drawn up for human cargo, though they called it indentured labor now. The coolie trade, as it became known, moved 12 million Asian bodies around the globe. They dug the gold mines in South Africa, cut sugarcane in Mauritius, laid railroad tracks across the American West. The term coolie itself was a racial designation used to mark these workers as something between slave and free, a category that could be exploited with fewer moral qualms than outright slavery. The ports that processed these workers hummed with bureaucratic efficiency. Medical inspections, contract certifications, transit permits, every document designed to create the illusion of consent while ensuring the reality of coercion. From Calcutta to San Francisco, from Hong Kong to Havana, the infrastructure of the second slavery wrapped the globe in a net of contracts and regulations. Chapter 8. The Coolie and the Railroad. The ship Robert Brown rocks in Amoy Harbor, 1852. 400 Chinese men are packed into its hold, bound for California. Below deck, someone has managed to steal a knife. Word passes through the darkness in Hokkien whispers. By dawn, the captives will kill the captain and most of his crew, choosing the uncertainty of drifting at sea over the certainty of bondage. Across the Pacific, other ships complete their journeys. Men from Guangdong and Fujian provinces stumble onto docks in San Francisco, Lima, Havana. They clutch contracts they often can't read, promises of wages that will prove to be lies, return passages that will never materialize. The British authorities have repurposed the word coolie, once simply meaning hired laborer, into a racial category that marks these men as somewhere between human and property. The system depends on existing networks of poverty and debt across Asia. Labor recruiters work through Chinese secret societies and Indian jobbers who know which villages have failed harvests, which families need money for dowries or funerals. A recruiter might offer a signing bonus that seems like fortune to a farmer who's never held so much cash. The contracts get explained quickly, optimistically. Reality waits on the other side of the ocean. In 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act, authorizing the transcontinental railroad that would bind America from coast to coast. The act granted railroad companies alternate sections of public land for every mile of track laid, land recently taken from native nations through treaties signed at gunpoint. The Central Pacific Railroad needed workers to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they found them on the docks of San Francisco. 90% of the workers who built the Central Pacific were Chinese. They earned half what white workers received for longer hours and more dangerous work. In the high Sierras, they were lowered in baskets down cliff faces to plant explosives in the rock. Sometimes the rope pulled up an empty basket. Through the winter of 1866, they dug through snowdrifts 40 feet deep. Avalanches buried entire camps. The company didn't count Chinese deaths in its official records. The men slept in camps that recreated the geography of home. Workers from the same village shared tents. They pooled wages to hire cooks who knew how to make proper rice, not the sticky mess the company provided. They formed mutual aid societies, contributing coins each week to a fund that would pay to ship a dead worker's bones home to China. Every man knew that dying here meant his spirit would wander unless his body returned to ancestral soil. In June 1867, 3,000 Chinese workers laid down their tools. They demanded an 8 to 10 hour workday instead of sunrise to sunset. They wanted the same pay as white workers. Most of all, they wanted an end to the whip, that symbol of slavery that overseers still cracked over their heads. The railroad superintendent Charles Crocker broke the strike by cutting off food supplies to the camps. After 8 days, starving men returned to work. The stereotype of the industrious Oriental served specific purposes. Newspaper editorials praised Chinese workers' endurance to shame newly freed black Americans who demanded fair wages. Politicians invoked Asian efficiency to justify seizing more native land for productive use. White workers, initially grateful for Chinese labor that spared them the most dangerous jobs, began to see these same workers as competition. The racial triangulation pitted oppressed against oppressed, while owners counted profits. By 1882, when the golden spike had long been driven and the railroad complete, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The same workers who blasted through mountains were now barred from entering the country. White labor unions celebrated in San Francisco streets. In Wyoming, mobs burned Chinatown to the ground. The men who built America's infrastructure had become America's undesirables. A woodcut made by a Chinese laborer in British Guiana captured the truth of the coolie system. It showed Indian and Chinese workers hanging upside down, while plantation owners drained their blood into barrels marked profit. The blood flowed upward through tubes into the great house where the owners feasted. The image needed no translation. This global system of indentured labor had created a world where race could be mapped, measured, and mobilized for profit. The plantation owners and railroad barons had learned to see human difference as a resource to exploit. But to manage this exploitation efficiently, to make it seem natural and inevitable, they would need something more sophisticated than whips and contracts. They would need science itself. Chapter 9. Cataloguing the World. Carl Linnaeus sits in his Uppsala garden in 1750, examining a pressed flower sent from the Carolina colonies. He holds it up to the light, counts the stamens, measures the petals, notes the arrangement of leaves. This evergreen shrub, which the Cherokee call ulfta and use to heal wounds, will become Kalmia latifolia, named after his student Per Kalm. With his pen, Linnaeus transforms a medicine into a monument to European discovery. His system is beautiful in its simplicity. Every living thing sorted into kingdoms, classes, orders, genera, species. Binomial nomenclature gives each organism 2 names, like a surname and given name, placing it within a family tree of all creation. For Linnaeus, this is an act of worship. The earth is God's museum, displaying the most admirable proofs of divine wisdom and power. To catalogue creation is to read the mind of God. His students, the ones he calls his apostles, board ships of the Dutch East India Company, the British Navy, the Swedish Royal Academy. They carry his instructions and empty specimen boxes that will return full. Pierre Kalm goes to North America, Carl Peter Thunberg to Japan, Daniel Solander joins Captain Cook's voyage to the Pacific. They collect seeds, pressed flowers, pickled fish, bird skins, human skulls. The African tree that Swahili speakers called munyama, essential for building boats that navigate the Indian Ocean, became Afzelia, after Adam Afzelius, who sent samples back to Sweden, traditional names that encoded centuries of knowledge about flowering times, medicinal uses, spiritual significance, all erased, replaced with Latin names honoring European men who spent a few months collecting specimens. The method extended to humans. Linnaeus created categories: Europaeus, albus, pale and inventive; Americanus, rufus, red and choleric; Asiaticus, luridus, yellow and melancholy; Africanus, niger, black and indolent. Each category included supposed characteristics of temperament and intelligence. The same system that sorted beetles and butterflies now sorted human beings into hierarchies of worth. This taxonomic thinking spread through European intellectual life. Philologists arranged the world's languages into family trees, with Sanskrit and Latin as noble ancestors, African languages as primitive grunts. Ethnologists created racial families, always with themselves at the apex of development. Every academic discipline adopted this method of comparison and classification, arranging the messy reality of human difference into neat categories that always somehow proved European superiority. Napoleon understood the power of this scientific approach. When he invaded Egypt in 1798, his ships carried 167 French scholars alongside the soldiers, mineralogists to assess mining potential, engineers to survey canal routes, linguists to decode hieroglyphics, biologists to catalogue flora and fauna. The invasion failed militarily, but the 23-volume Description de l'Égypte succeeded in transforming Egypt into an object of European knowledge mapped and measured for future exploitation. The British pursued their own information empire in India. They contracted the Schlagintweit brothers, German scientists, to map the subcontinent's topography and magnetism. The brothers traveled with over 100 local guides, translators, porters, and experts, whose names never appeared in the published reports. Indigenous knowledge holders became invisible labor in the production of colonial science. These expeditions filled the British Museum, the Louvre, the Berlin Ethnological Museum, mummies unwrapped for public entertainment, sacred objects displayed as primitive art, human remains stored in basement collections, numbered and catalogued like pressed flowers. The museums became warehouses of empire, displaying the world's cultures as trophies of European reach. The contradiction at the heart of this project grew sharper each year. The system claimed to reveal universal natural laws, yet it depended entirely on European categories and perspectives. It presented itself as objective science, while serving as a tool of subjugation. The Linnaean system promised to reveal God's order but created a hierarchy that placed some of God's children in museums and others in palaces. By the late 1800s, this classificatory science had evolved into something more sinister. The measurement of human bodies became an obsession. Skull capacity, facial angles, skin tone, every aspect of human variation became data for racial science. The specimen collectors who once gathered plants now gathered people, and the museums that displayed pressed flowers began displaying human beings themselves. Chapter 10: Human Zoos and Racial Science. The crowds push through the gates of Treptower Park in Berlin, 1896. Children tug their parents toward the African pavilion where a Herero family sits beside a reconstructed hut. The father sharpens a spear he will never use for hunting. The mother weaves a basket while German spectators take photographs. Their children play a game with stones, trying to ignore the faces pressed against the fence that separates them from the paying public. Felix von Luschan moves through the colonial exhibition with a leather case containing 36 colored glass tiles. He approaches a young man from German East Africa, gestures for him to remove his shirt. The man complies. He has no choice. Von Luschan lifts the man's arm, searching for skin untouched by Sunday. He runs his glass tiles along the patch of flesh until he finds a match, then writes a number in his notebook. The crowd watches this measurement like a performance. Von Luschan serves as curator at the Berlin Ethnological Museum and Germany's most prominent physical anthropologist. For him, the human zoo is a laboratory. He measures skull circumferences with calipers, documents nose widths, photographs, subjects from front and profile like criminals. Each measurement gets recorded in tables that will prove what he already believes, that humanity can be ranked like specimens in a cabinet. 7 years later, these same measurements guided genocide. In 1903, the Herero and Nama peoples rose against German colonial rule in Namibia. The Schutztruppe responded with Vernichtungskrieg, war of annihilation. General Lothar von Trotha issued his extermination order. Every Herero found within German territory would be shot. Women, children, the elderly, no exceptions. Those who fled were driven into the Omaheke Desert, where German soldiers poisoned the water holes and waited for thirst to finish their work. More than 100,000 people died. The survivors were herded into concentration camps on Shark Island, a peninsula jutting into the Atlantic. Witnesses described what happened next. Male prisoners were murdered and their bodies swiftly harvested for German scientific investigation. Women were forced to boil the heads of their own relatives, then scrape the flesh from skulls with shards of glass. The cleaned skulls were packed in crates, shipped to Berlin for study. Von Luschan coordinated this trade in human remains from his museum office. He wrote letters to colonial administrators requesting specimens. By the end of his life, his personal collection contained more than 7,000 skulls of over-Herero people. These were separate from the thousands more he acquired for state institutions. After his death, the collection was sold to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where it remains today, stored in climate-controlled rooms that the public never sees. The Lushan skin color scale became the standard tool for racial classification. A report described its use. He made him take off his shirt and lift his arm because he wanted a patch of where the sun had never shone. He ran the cards along the patch of skin until the match. That gave him a number that he wrote down. Average these numbers across a population, and you could assign an entire people a single shade, a number that determined their place in the racial hierarchy. In 1914, von Lushan brought his methods to America to study what he called the American Negro problem. He traveled through the Jim Crow South with local academics and government officials as guides. They took him to plantations where he measured more than 350 African Americans, treating them as data points in his global racial survey. American historian William Du Bois wrote to von Lushan with barely contained fury, "I am afraid that you are getting a one-sided view of the Negro problem. You must remember that in America it is arranged that foreigners should see the American side of the race difficulties. I can also disabuse your mind of the assumptions that American Negroes are content." Years later, Du Bois recalled von Lushan's response in a speech. While race might not determine inferiority, the German scientist concluded, racial and national antagonism will remain. A nation's vital interests she will, if necessary, defend with blood and iron. The mask slipped. Behind the measurements and charts and scientific language lay simple violence, the willingness to kill for supremacy. The tools of racial science, calipers and color scales and skull measurements, spread through museums and universities worldwide. Physical anthropology departments filled their storage rooms with stolen bones. The violence of colonialism dressed itself in academic robes, published in journals, taught to students who would carry these ideas into governments and schools and churches where they would shape the education of generations. Chapter 11: The Civilizing Mission and the Classroom. 1600, in the plaza of a Mexican town, indigenous actors perform a mock battle between Moors and Christians. Spanish missionaries watch from the shade as the drama unfolds, turbaned villains wielding wooden scimitars, noble Christians bearing crosses like swords. The play recreates Spain's reconquest, the expulsion of Muslims and Jews in 1492, though the indigenous performers have never seen a Moor or visited Iberia. At the finale, the defeated Moors kneel for baptism, and the audience is invited forward for their own conversion. History becomes pedagogy, becomes conquest. The native Mexica actors know the script demands their submission, but they find ways to resist. In one recorded performance, the doomed Muslim king surprisingly turned into that of the conqueror Cortés. The indigenous players acted out their desire to be rid of their oppressor while appearing to follow the approved narrative. They performed obedience while encoding defiance, making the colonizer's story tell their own truth. This tension, whether to conquer by force or by persuasion, erupted at the Valladolid debate in 1550. Two Dominican friars argued before Spanish royal officials. Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda insisted indigenous people were natural slaves who should be conquered by violence. Bartolomé de las Casas countered that natives needed to be colonized through Christian love, to be improved rather than destroyed. De las Casas won the debate. His argument, which framed colonialism as a gift rather than a theft, became the foundation of what would be called the civilizing mission. By the late 1700s, this ideology of improvement shaped British policy in India. Governor-General Cornwallis initiated projects in urban planning, public health, and education. Utilitarian philosophers provided the intellectual framework, advocating for the application of European science to improve colonial society. They built hospitals that ignored Ayurvedic medicine, courts that dismissed centuries of local jurisprudence, schools that taught English history while erasing Indian pasts. Thomas Macaulay crafted the most influential blueprint in his 1834 minute on Indian education. He argued for creating a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These English-educated Indians would serve as intermediaries, translating imperial will to the masses. British-style universities sprouted across the subcontinent, their Gothic towers rising incongruously from tropical landscapes. The French pursued a different strategy in Vietnam after their conquest in 1884. They promoted association rather than pure assimilation, styling themselves as protectors of Vietnamese culture from Chinese influence. Governor-General Albert Sarraud's reforms in 1917 closed traditional Chinese-style schools, abolished Confucian examinations, and promoted the Romanized Vietnamese script Quoc Engi U. They claimed to preserve while they transformed, to protect while they destroyed. Sarraud himself recognized the dreadful dilemma. Restricting education could lead to protest, but expanding it could create educated critics of the regime. This paradox materialized in the grand halls of the Lycée Albert Sarraud in Hanoi. Some graduates, like the journalist Pham Quynh, became collaborators who believed in a modern Vietnam within the French Empire. Others took different paths. A young man from a peasant family named Nguyen Sin Kung used the educational and transport networks of the empire to travel the world. He worked on French ships, studied in Paris libraries, witnessed colonial oppression from London to Moscow. He returned with a new name, Ho Chi Minh, and a revolutionary vision. The institutions designed to produce loyal subjects had created their own gravediggers. The civilizing mission assumed that colonized peoples wanted to become copies of their colonizers, that progress meant abandoning their own cultures for European ways. It dressed violence in the language of benevolence, made theft seem like charity. The classroom became another battlefield, where minds rather than bodies were the contested territory. Across the ocean in North America, settler colonies faced a different challenge. Their indigenous populations weren't meant to be governed, but replaced. Education there would take on a more absolute purpose, to kill the Indian and save the man. As one school founder would say, the classroom would become a factory for erasure, where children would be processed into forgetting who they had been. Chapter 12. Kill the Indian, save the man. The train arrives at Carlisle Station in Pennsylvania. It's the year 1879. Lakota children peer through grimy windows at the former army barracks that will become their world. They still wear traditional dress, their hair long and braided in the ways their mothers taught them. Within hours, the braids will lie on the floor like severed ropes. Captain Richard H. Pratt, the school's founder, watches the transformation begin. His motto hangs over the entrance: kill the Indian and save the man. The barracks smell of lye soap and military discipline. Boys are dressed in stiff uniforms that scratch their skin. Girls receive Victorian dresses that make movement feel like punishment. Speaking Lakota or Cherokee or any of the dozens of languages that arrived with these children means a beating. The silence that follows is filled with English words that feel like stones in their mouths. Cutting the hair is the deepest wound. For many indigenous cultures, long hair connects the physical and spiritual worlds. It grows from the body but reaches toward the sky, a ladder between earth and heaven. The barbers work methodically, ignoring the tears. Some children believe their souls are being severed. The photographs taken before and after become propaganda. Wild children transformed into civilized citizens, or so the school's promotional materials claim. The outing system extends the school's reach beyond its walls. During summers, thousands of indigenous children are placed with white families. Girls become domestic servants, cooking meals they've never tasted, cleaning houses larger than entire villages. Boys labor on farms, forbidden to leave the property without a chaperone. The families are instructed to prevent any contact with the children's own communities. This is education through isolation. In the classrooms, history becomes weaponized fiction. Children learn about brave pioneers settling empty lands, about civilization triumphing over savagery. They're forced to memorize stories that erase their own existence. On stage during school performances, they must dress in buckskins and war paint, playing savage Indians being conquered by noble settlers. They perform their own cultural death for audiences who applaud their transformation. Sunday means mandatory Sabbath school, where Christianity replaces indigenous spirituality. The Creator becomes God, the earth becomes fallen creation requiring dominion. Sacred stories that taught how to live in balance with the land are replaced with tales of sin and redemption. Children who once knew themselves as relatives of eagles and bears learn they are descendants of Adam, fallen and requiring salvation. All indigenous forms of recreation are banned. No traditional games, no ancestral songs, no dances that connected communities to the rhythm of the earth. The playground becomes another classroom where children learn to play like white Americans, baseball instead of lacrosse, marching instead of dancing, even joy must be colonized. Behind the main buildings, archaeologists would later find evidence of resistance. Children carved traditional symbols into hidden corners. They whispered stories in the dark after lights out. They created new forms of old games, using whatever materials they could find. Some ran away, though most were caught and punished. Others resisted by excelling, learning the colonizers' knowledge to fight the colonizers' system. The psychological damage went deeper than any physical abuse. Graduates returned to reservations, speaking English their families couldn't understand, practicing Christianity their elders saw as betrayal. They belonged nowhere, too Indian for white society, too white for their own communities. Many descended into alcoholism or suicide, caught between worlds that wouldn't accept them. For all intents and purposes, many of these children were stolen from their cultures, just as their cultures were stolen from them. The residential school system spread across North America and Australia, processing hundreds of thousands of indigenous children through its machinery of erasure. Each school operated on Pratt's principle that indigenous peoples had no future as indigenous peoples. The residential school was designed to break the chain of cultural transmission, to ensure that indigenous knowledge would die with the older generation. It was cultural genocide, dressed in the language of education and charity. Yet the schools failed in their ultimate purpose. Indigenous cultures survived, went underground, adapted, and eventually emerged to demand justice for what had been done in those barracks and classrooms where childhood went to die. While North American schools tried to erase indigenous peoples entirely, empires elsewhere developed subtler weapons. They discovered that debt could destroy nations as effectively as armies, that financial chains could bind more tightly than iron ones. Chapter 13. The Weaponization of Debt. 1825. French gunboats sit in the harbor of Port-au-Prince. Their cannons point toward the city where President Boyer weighs an impossible choice. France demands 150 million francs as compensation for its loss of property during the Haitian Revolution, property that included human beings who freed themselves. The warships wait. Boyer signs. Haiti, the world's only free black republic, enters a bondage of a different kind. The anthropologist David Graeber wrote that debt can be a way of punishing winners who weren't supposed to win. Haiti had committed the unforgivable sin of successful revolution. Now it would pay for that victory for the next 122 years. To meet the first payment, Haiti borrowed from French banks at crushing interest rates. To pay those loans, it borrowed from American banks. Each loan required new loans to service it, a spiral that wouldn't end until 1947. This practice of militarized debt collection became standard imperial procedure. In 1861, British, French, and Spanish gunboats blockaded Mexico to extract payments. In 1902, Britain, Germany, and Italy sank Venezuelan ships until debts were acknowledged. The message was clear. Sovereignty existed only as long as payments continued. The Ottoman Empire became the primary laboratory for what Manjapra calls colonization through lending. Following the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Ottoman government began selling bonds on European markets to cover military expenses. Between 1854 and 1874, the state took out 15 massive foreign loans from British and French banks. The interest compounded faster than any economy could grow. By 1865, annual debt payments nearly equaled the empire's entire state income. When the Ottomans defaulted in 1875 on £252 million, European banking houses imposed their solution. They created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, a foreign council with representatives from France, Germany, Britain, and other creditor nations. This shadow government employed 8,000 local workers under European direction. It seized control of customs duties, salt monopolies, tobacco revenues. 1/3 of all Ottoman state income flowed directly to European creditors. A single Ottoman bond from 1903 tells the whole story. Issued to fund the German-led Baghdad Railway, this piece of paper became what Manjapra calls a colonial and racial leash, binding generations of Turkish taxpayers to Western banks. The railway itself served German strategic interests, creating a route to Persian oil fields. The debt wouldn't be fully paid until the 1950s, long after the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. Karl Helfrich embodied this new breed of financial colonizer. He oversaw the Ottoman Debt Administration, helped design the Baghdad Railway financing, then moved to German East Africa, where his monetary policies reduced African wages and sparked the Maji-Maji Rebellion in 1905. He returned to Germany as a director of Deutsche Bank and became Treasury Secretary during World War I. The same man who engineered debt in Constantinople and rebellion in Tanzania now managed the German war economy. The United States developed its own version called dollar diplomacy. Marines landed in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, always with the stated purpose of restoring fiscal order. The most brazen incident occurred in 1914. The USS Machias anchored off Port-au-Prince. Marines marched to the Banque Nationale de Haiti, removed $500,000 in gold from its vaults, and loaded it onto their ship. They sailed to New York, where the gold disappeared into Wall Street banks. The theft was recorded as debt service. These financial weapons proved more effective than armies. A conquered nation might eventually expel foreign soldiers, but debt followed governments across revolutions and regime changes. New leaders inherited old obligations. Revolutionary governments found themselves paying colonial debts. The papers signed under gunboat threat became more binding than any treaty. The infrastructure of debt required physical infrastructure to generate payments. Railways to move resources to ports, canals to speed ships between oceans, telegraphs to coordinate extraction. The same financial instruments that funded conquest also funded the transformation of physical space, the cutting of continents, and joining of seas that would reshape the planet itself. Chapter 14. Canals, Partitions, and the British Indian Ocean Territory. The Suez Canal cuts through the desert like a surgical incision. 1869. Ferdinand de Lesseps stands on a platform addressing European dignitaries, calling his canal a pensée morale, an ethical vision to connect the backwards Orient with the forward-moving West. Below, Egyptian workers who dug this trench lie in mass graves. 20,000 dead from cholera and exhaustion. The canal opens, and warships that once sailed around Africa now slip through in days. Theodore Roosevelt watches the French failure at Panama and sees American opportunity. In 1903, the United States orchestrates Panama's independence from Colombia, then immediately signs a canal treaty with the new nation. General George Washington Goethals takes command of the Canal Zone, declaring he wants it to function like a large corporate enterprise and not the government of a local republic. Military authority, corporate efficiency, and state power fuse into a single machine. To create the canal's central passage, the Americans flooded the Chagres River basin. Lake Gatun rose, an artificial sea that drowned 21 villages. 20,000 residents fled water that climbed toward their doors. Entire communities vanished beneath the surface. Churches, cemeteries, the trees where children had played. The lake became the highest point of the canal. Ships lifted by locks to sail above drowned towns. The Canal Zone operated under Jim Crow segregation. White American workers drew wages from the gold roll, paid in gold-backed dollars. Black Caribbean migrants, indentured Asians, and local Panamanians worked the silver roll, paid less in silver pesos for more dangerous labor. A 1909 photograph captured this hierarchy. Black laborers toiling in the muddy pit, while a lone white foreman stood on a rock mass above them, the surveilling overseer watching the watched. While canals joined oceans, partition lines severed continents. The historian A.I. Asiwaju described the African experience as political surgery. At the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, European powers gathered around maps of Africa with rulers and red pens. They drew straight lines through communities with common ancestry, strong kinship ties, shared socio-political institutions, and economic resources. A single line could split villages, separate families, divide grazing lands that communities had shared for centuries. These arbitrary borders became concrete realities. The 1921 partition of Ireland created a frontier through Ulster. The 1947 Radcliffe Line split India and Pakistan in 6 weeks of map-making that triggered one of history's largest mass migrations. 15 million people crossing new borders amid communal violence. The 1948 Israeli military partition of Palestine created 700,000 refugees in what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Each partition followed the same logic. Imperial convenience trumped human geography. Borders were drawn in distant capitals by men who'd never walked the land they were dividing. Communities that had survived centuries of local conflicts found themselves separated by international frontiers. Traditional trade routes became smuggling paths. Seasonal migrations became illegal border crossings. The story continues into our present. In the 1960s, the Pentagon identifies Diego Garcia, a coral atoll in the Indian Ocean, as the perfect location for a military base. Britain, the colonial power, agrees to help. They partition the island from the surrounding Chagos archipelago and create a new entity, the British Indian Ocean Territory. Between 1968 and 1973, the entire population of 2,000 Chagosian people, descendants of enslaved Africans, are forced onto ships. The deportation unfolds with calculated cruelty. British officers round up the islanders' dogs, their companions and hunting partners, and gas them in sealed sheds. The Chagosians are given one suitcase each and herded onto cargo ships. They're dumped in Mauritius and the Seychelles, 2,000 kilometers from home, with no compensation, no housing, no plan for their survival. The Americans build their base, Camp Justice, which they nickname their footprint of freedom. Charlesia Alexis, one of the exiled, leads the Chagos refugees group in their fight to return. Her Sega songs carry across the decades. When I lived in Diego, I was like a beautiful bird in the sky. Since I've been in Mauritius, we are living a worthless life. Help me, my friend. Help me to sing, to send our message to the world. The British government continues to deny their right to return, claiming the islands are needed for defense purposes. The power to remake geography, to flood valleys and split continents, to empty islands and fill them with weapons. This power echoes into our present, creating refugees who sing of homes they cannot reach, borders that separate families, bases that occupy stolen ground. Chapter 15. The Echoing Present. James Baldwin writes to his nephew on December 1st, 1962, exactly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. His nephew, also named James, sits in an American prison cell. Baldwin's letter carries the weight of generations. I keep seeing your face, which is also the face of your father and my brother. Behind your father's face, as it is today, are all those other faces which were his. Time collapses in these words. The past lives in the present, what Toni Morrison would call re-memory, the way history haunts us through our bones. That prison cell where young James sits is part of a larger architecture of confinement that Baldwin knew would only grow. Today, Black Lives Matter emerges from this same grief. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, names that become incantations against forgetting. The movement sees clearly what Baldwin saw. The prison industrial complex and militarized policing are direct descendants of slavery and Jim Crow. The statistics tell their own story. Black men are 9 times more likely than other Americans to be murdered by police. African Americans are overrepresented in the prison population by 80%. This colonial violence against black bodies connects to other struggles across the continent. At Standing Rock in January 2016, water protectors gather under the Lakota banner, Muni Wikoni, water is life. They're fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, which threatens to run beneath the Missouri River. The pipeline's proposed route has already destroyed 280 indigenous sites, including sacred burial grounds. The same extractive logic that built railroads through native land now pushes oil through it. The images from Standing Rock, militarized police deploying water cannons in sub-zero temperatures, reveal how little has changed since the Indian Wars. These scenes inspire solidarity across borders. Idle No More rises in Canada. Buen Vivir movements spread through South America. Indigenous peoples everywhere recognize the same enemy in different uniforms, the same theft wearing different legal masks. The tentacles of this system reach across oceans. In Nigeria, 2012, millions flood the streets when the government removes fuel subsidies under pressure from the International Monetary Fund. The Occupy Nigeria movement understands this as neo-colonial extraction, foreign financial institutions dictating domestic policy just as they did in the Ottoman Empire a century before. The protests paralyze the country until the government partially retreats. These local eruptions become continental conversations. In December 2018, activists from 25 African countries converge in Dakar for the Popular University for Civic Engagement. Groups like Yanamare from Senegal and Balai Citoyen from Burkina Faso shared tactics for resisting the oligarchies that serve foreign powers. They operate in what scholars call political society, grassroots organizing outside official channels, the same space where Maroons once planned their rebellions. The patterns of resistance mirror the patterns of oppression. American sociologist William Du Bois documented this in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction, showing how elites shatter multiracial coalitions by mobilizing racial fear. During Reconstruction, white planters destroyed the alliance between freed slaves and poor whites through Jim Crow laws and gerrymandering. Du Bois called it a tried and trusted bag of tricks that elites still deploy whenever the oppressed threaten to unite. Sometimes resistance takes the form of a voice carrying across borders that bodies cannot cross. Paul Robeson stood at the US-Canada line in 1952, his passport revoked for advocating colonial independence. Unable to cross, he sang to thousands on the Canadian side. Naomi Shihabni captured it. He sang into Canada. His voice left the USA when his body was not allowed to cross that line. Robeson later reflected, "Songs of liberation, who can lock them up? The spirit of freedom, who can jail it?" From Port-au-Prince, where France's debt still cripples development, to Standing Rock, where water protectors face rubber bullets, from Dakar, where activists build new futures, to Diego Garcia, where the exiled still sing of home, the colonial present continues. The structures persist in police departments, descended from slave patrols, in borders that separate families, in bases occupying stolen islands. But so does the singing. The voices of the colonized still rise, still carry across the lines drawn to contain them, still insist that another world waits just beyond the next uprising.